Hello and welcome to Drydock episode 54, otherwise known as the Patreon Q&A session. That is the one you get near the beginning of each month, so it's going to be a long one, obviously. Let's get on with the questions, but I will say very quickly now that given the last time that we did this, the thing ran to over 2 hours, and a few people were saying that is a little bit too long to watch all in one video. Okay, I acknowledge that. And what I'm going to be doing is, well, the overall length of this Q&A is not going to go away, but what we are going to do, I think, is split it up. So every time I hit the hour mark, I will stop, render that video, and then it'll be part A, part B, part C, etc. Uploading in with hour-long gaps as we go. So let's see how that works. If that proves a little bit more popular with people than me uploading 2 to 3 hours of a single video, then we'll do that in future for further Patreon Q&As. Anyway, with that said, let's get on with the video. Oh, just one other quick note. I will be incorporating some of the competition winner questions into this Drydock as well, since it seems the best place to put the questions. So, Dunk Master Flex asks, prior to and into World War I, the Canadian Navy had multiple different plans to create a fleet. The two plans with the most traction was the cash gift to Britain for 3 modern battleships or battlecruisers, or a fleet of 6 Acorn-class destroyers and 4 Weymouth-class cruisers, domestically built and operated. In your opinion, which of the two plans would have been better for Canada and the Empire as a whole? Do you think another plan would suit both better? Of those options, I think the battleship/battlecruiser option probably would have been a lot better. Pictured here, courtesy of Shipbucket, is the design U4, which was a modified version of the Queen Elizabeth class, which was one of the alternatives presented to Canada. So the reason I say that is because, well, put it bluntly, 6 destroyers and 4 light cruisers built immediately before World War I they would have been useful, but they also would have been obsolete in about 10 years, which doesn't really help matters long term. Whereas 3 derivative Queen Elizabeth class, and assuming that with these design changes they can actually get them to hit the 25 knots that the Queen Elizabeth class was supposed to hit in the first place, those would be incredibly useful and incredibly powerful. Because apart from anything, well, that puts another 3 fast battleships for the time in place of, well, they're new, so they're not in place of anything, but it puts them into the Grand Fleet in time for Jutland, because some of the R-class, which of course the follow-on were there for Jutland. I mean, that potentially changes Jutland massively if 5th Battle Squadron is, let's say, 7 Queen Elizabeths or derivatives instead of 4, and with these 3 obviously being just that little bit faster, they're not necessarily going to save all the British battle cruisers, but they might show up just a little bit sooner, and therefore start laying the hurt down on the German battle cruisers a little bit faster. That's a relatively short-term gain for the British, but long-term, these ships, if they then stay in service, are going to radically affect the balance of power when it comes to the various naval treaties, because they're going to displace more than the King George V's and the Iron Dukes that were retained historically at first. But it also means that those 13.5-inch gunships are probably going to go by the wayside almost immediately, which leaves the Royal Navy with a full 15-inch armed battle fleet, at least until Nelson and Rodney show up, which is very useful for them. And it also means that maintenance and refits can be planned a lot further in advance, so potentially more of the Royal Navy gets refitted to modernised standards. And by the time of the London Naval Treaty, you definitely want to keep these things above some of the R-class that were getting a bit worn out. So overall, it both has potential positive impacts on World War I directly, but also in World War II, it means the Royal Navy goes into the war with a significantly more capable battle force that, in terms of capital ships, than it historically did. Whether or not that may mean that some of the R's might get turned into aircraft carrier conversions at some point, who knows? I would rather hope not, given that Eagle was not especially useful, and yeah, the R's would just be a slightly bigger version of that. But who knows, flight decks do count, I suppose. As for any other potentially viable plans, I can't see any others suiting both parties better. I mean, obviously Canada's going to have a little bit of a problem crewing 3 entire battleships, but as per HMAS Australia and HMNZS New Zealand, at least during the First World War, there's no reason they couldn't just leave them with the Royal Navy and then kind of have a clause in there that we need them for our own defence if necessary, which, to be fair, in time of like World War II is pretty much going to be doing what the Royal Navy says anyway. And yeah, so they have the best advantage at that point, because what other options are there? I mean, I suppose you could go with the design Y battlecruisers instead, which again, as I've said before, would be a fairly positive impact. But you're pretty much playing horses for courses at that point between design Y and these things. So there's much of a muchness. You definitely don't want them to revert back to doing some kind of Lion derivative, because, as we've said before, like much as HMS Tiger is a relatively nice ship, it would have limited use in the Second World War compared to something like this or a design Y ship. So yeah, I think probably the 3 modern battleship battlecruiser plan would have been the best option if they managed to get it through the Canadian government, and it probably would have had a fairly significant positive knock-on to naval campaigns in the Second World War. Lurk asks quite the extensive question. He says, from what I understand, in the 15th century, the Ming Dynasty managed to make China into a pre-eminent naval power through the use of the Ming Treasure Fleet from 1405 to 1433, but effectively threw all of that away for a variety of reasons and had destroyed all the ships by about 1525. Do you think it would have been possible to avoid this, and for the Chinese to maintain a strong naval tradition throughout the centuries until they become a regional or even world power capable of effectively resisting the British come the First Opium War? Or would the rather memetic capacity for corruption within the officials of the Chinese government have eventually doomed such a thing from ever happening? Well, first of all, just a brief side note to say that Admiral Zheng He, or possibly Zheng He, I'm sure there's somebody who can pronounce Chinese somewhere who will comment in this comments thread. But anyway, him and his treasure fleet model, I should say, of possible treasure ship format seen here as compared to what most of Europe was using at the time, was quite the impressive achievement, and to be honest, one of the few things I'd classify as a sort of a post-Roman Empire wonder of the world that I'd really rather they kept 1 or 2 of them. I'd really have liked to see one full size. I know there's a couple of replicas in China of some treasure fleet designs, but I don't think they've got anything that's kind of like a full size version of this. Anyway, rambling about the beauty of the ships aside, well, the Ming Dynasty up to the Opium War, that's an awful lot of history to cover. So, I mean, I can't necessarily... Well, there's no way I can guarantee that any of the predictions that might come about would actually carry through, because there's far too many butterflies going on. And as you said, yes, there is the rather interesting problem of corruption within the Chinese system. To be honest, the single biggest problem is actually just the Chinese outlook on things. They were perfectly happy as the predominant power in the area. They thought that they pretty much were the ultimate power, and that kind of thinking just set in. I mean, the whole reason they, as far as I understand it, at least, that they junked the treasure fleet was effectively that they'd gone out as far as they thought was reasonable, couldn't find anyone who even began to approach the glory of Imperial China, and just went, well, what do we actually need this lot for? There's no one out there we're actually vaguely interested in speaking with, so off to the scrapyard it goes. I mean, I know that's a very sort of short form version of events, and I'm sure someone will be able again to give full chapter and verses to the precise circumstances of why the poor old treasure fleet ended up as so much kindling, but never mind. Assuming that we somehow managed to change Chinese culture to a point that they actually want to keep the fleet, and no, just coming into contact with Europe is probably not going to do that, given that they already had trade with Europe by land, and Well, again, look at that model. Do you really think that the Chinese treasure fleet coming across a fleet of European ships that look like that is actually going to change their mind about them being top of the world and preeminent in practically everything? Um, I mean, it really did set in by the 19th century to the point they refused to acknowledge, well, the superiority of anybody, which was something of a problem, as you point out, during the Opium Wars when people showed up with modern cannons and iron ships, which tended to make mincemeat of whatever passed for the Chinese Navy at that point, mostly fleets of war junks, which, yeah, didn't work out very well for them. But anyway, um, if was it possible? Yeah, as I say, if you change the Chinese outlook, maybe let's see what's going on at that kind of time period. I mean, maybe if they'd come across the Battle of La Rochelle, that falls into the time period of the Great Treasure Fleets, and assuming somebody had somehow managed to wander their way over to Western Europe and they saw the European navies going at it, with particularly the Castilians having cannon on board their ships, that might have inspired a little bit of extra interest in naval activity, but that requires quite a large divergence from where the treasure fleets actually went. But so yeah, it's going to be a real struggle to come up with a plausible scenario in which the Chinese decide to keep their treasure fleet and or a large navy with their outlook and basically the historical reach that they actually did. Um, as far as a naval tradition generally, again, it depends where they went. You could have, I mean, the only thing I can really think of would be if, as per, I think there's a couple of fictional books that detail a supposed voyage by the treasure fleets across the Pacific where they end up discovering America. Now that might do it because, well, it's a new land. It's new opportunities. Not that the Chinese were the world's biggest colonizers at the time, but hey, pretty much. Well, actually, we don't even necessarily know if it's untapped land. There was quite a large population and arguably a number of fairly interesting civilizations in North America prior to the arrival of various interesting European diseases. So possibly they could have run into those as well. But well, I think simply the fact that running into land that they didn't know existed before might prompt the Chinese to set up trading outposts, um, exploration, that kind of thing. That might then keep a kind of long range, long distance Chinese navy going, which will give them a naval tradition of some description. On the flip side, the fact that, well, ships like this would be eminently capable of carrying out that kind of voyage would mean that, again, as per Chinese culture, there'd probably be a relative amount of stagnation. Although, with that said, if they are looking a little bit more outward navally, they might then notice the achievements of the Koreans and their turtle ships a few decades down the line when they're fighting the Japanese. That may then inspire them to go with the whole, perhaps guns are a good idea on our ships, and possibly even some form of early iron armour. But then again, you have to look at why would they do that? They're not likely to be at war with Japan unless the Japanese do something particularly stupid to a Chinese warship that's floating around watching the whole thing go down. The Koreans even less likely so. They've got enough problems to deal with the Japanese without inviting a massive land invasion. And you're not exactly going to have that many pirates in the Pacific when the Chinese are probably the only people in town with significant ocean-going warships. I mean, China did have its own pirate issues, but there's pirate fleets made up of junks that are sailing around the Chinese coast, and then there's the plausibility of the Chinese pirates setting up a fleet of these kind of things to actually go somewhere and do something useful against long-distance Chinese treasure fleets or commerce fleets or possibly even colonial communication fleets. You never know. Yeah, that's not really going to happen. So, yeah, naval tradition potentially under those circumstances. Ideas about arming ships and using armour again potentially under those circumstances. Corruption is obviously always going to be an issue. Being able to resist the British come the First Opium War, well, they do a better job of it, but I don't think even this kind of thing would really do much. It basically just comes down to the fact that even if we give the Chinese a reason to keep their fleet around, the simple fact of the matter is that they don't have any peer challengers until the Europeans show up. At which point, with the Europeans obviously having gone through things like the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, the various wars with the Ottoman Empire, in no particular chronological order, obviously, it means that European warship building and naval gunnery technology has advanced quite significantly. Now, okay, fair enough. The Nemesis coming up against a fleet of war junks armed with fairly low weight cannon versus Nemesis and or other East India Company ships and British Navy ships eventually coming up against something like this, those are two completely different ball games. However, again, if they haven't really had any reason to develop their naval cannon to the kind of large smashing weapons that are sort of 22-pounder, 24-pounder, 32-pounder weapons that the Europeans have, you're just going to have a lot more of relatively ineffective fire. I suppose, though, thinking about it on the fly, you might have a certain degree of adaptability, because if they have a naval tradition and they've seen all these European trading ships coming, then rather than just going, oh yes, well, that's just how the barbarians get to us to honour our glorious emperor, a more navally minded China might look at them and go, well, we might say we are only interested in your silver, but a few of those guns might not go amiss either. And, well, considering the Europeans were desperately running out of silver, which is part of the reason for the Opium Wars ultimately, I can see a few shady backroom deals being done for some heavy cannon, and if they've still got ships of this kind around or some idea of how to build them, these ships can support some fairly heavy cannons. So yes, I suppose if you want to skate down a really thin knife edge of somehow, possibly by discovering America, the Chinese maintain an interest in naval technology, and they're quick enough to clock on to what European ships can do when European trading opens up in China, and they don't somehow fall afoul of about 300 to 400 years of Chinese political corruption in the interim, then yes, in theory, you could have seen some kind of slightly bizarrely shaped ship-of-the-line equivalent with lots of sails like this thing. But that's a very, very outside edge scenario. It's possible. Whether or not it's plausible or not, I don't think so, but that's just me. Well, hopefully that gives a relatively comprehensive answer to what was, to be fair, a fairly comprehensive question. Matthew J. Bryce asks, did HMS Saumarez have the same commander in the battle against the Scharnhorst and in the battle against the Haguro? The answer to that would be no. The captain of HMS Saumarez during the Battle of the North Cape was one Lieutenant Commander Eric Norman Walmsley, and he was in command of the ship until the end of January, beginning of February 1944, having joined the ship in May 1943. Whilst during the attack on Haguro, I think it's Haguro, it was commanded by the rather wonderfully named Manly Power. Yes, Captain Manly Power, DSO-OBERN, and later to retire as an admiral. Actually one of the most notable destroyer commanders of the war in Royal Navy service, and he was the one who led the Saumarez during its encounter with that particular Japanese cruiser. Avatar 73 asks, can you tell us what was the long-term effect of the success of CSS Alabama on future wars? He then goes on to say, it seems like the success of raiders is always romanticised. However, it also seems as though the great raiders have always belonged to the Navy with the lesser naval presence in a given war. Both world wars saw the Germans with a legendary raider, Emden and Graf Spee, and they seem to carry the tradition of the Alabama in more ways than one, especially as they all ended in similar ways. Is commerce raiding always the path of the weaker state in a war, the act of a desperate nation? Well, to answer the latter part of the question first, yes, basically pretty much commerce raiding is almost entirely always going to be the path of the lesser power, and that's basically for the very good reason that if you're in an unequal naval fight, then you're going to end up with one side basically sweeping the seas of the other side's commerce very quickly using their conventional warships, and thus they have no particular need for raiders. So this is kind of the case with both world wars. Conversely, if you have a war between actual peer opponents, then both sides get in on the action. So when we looked at HMS Indefatigable, that war, well, the series of wars that broadly put in together as the Napoleonic Wars, that was a fight generally up until the latter stages between peer opponents, and as such both the British and French navies were consistently commerce raiding as a way to try and cripple the other's economy, because, well, they couldn't outright destroy each other, because actually both sides had far too many ships to assemble for one particular battle, and for obvious reasons, after the first few battles tended to go badly for the French, they weren't particularly enthusiastic about throwing ships into other major battles, but there you go. The only exceptions to that are really periods when a major war starts between two significantly powerful maritime powers in terms of merchant marine, but where one side, for whatever reason, doesn't have a particularly powerful naval arm. So the War of 1812 would be an exception to that rule, where the USA is granted, yes, it did try to do some commerce raiding, but the USA in 1812 actually had a significant portion of the world's merchant fleet. They were very much a maritime trading power, but they didn't have the navy to back it up, at which point the British, via their own warships and privateers, just went, ooh, nice merchant navy, shame if something were to happen to it. On a related note, we happen to have a large number of slightly used, partially damaged merchant ships for sale. Does anybody want to buy? So yeah, that's kind of a unique situation where there's an exception to that rule, because there's, to be honest, there's not that many times you have a major oceanic trading power that doesn't have a very powerful navy, but there's always an exception that proves the rule. But in terms of its long-term legacy, one of the things that Alabama primarily, but generally speaking the Confederate raiders taken as a whole, managed to introduce into the world was actually the idea of international arbitration, because the Americans, obviously the Union being rather aggrieved at the actions of Alabama and other similar British-built merchant raiders, as we covered in the Alabama video, they wanted money back, but as powerful as the Union Navy was in coastal operations, the USA of the end of the American Civil War was in no position to make demands of the British Empire in terms of money by the traditional method, which is pay us or we'll shoot you, because the British were going, oh, okay, you want to try it that way, let's go then. And that would have ended badly for both sides, I think. But it meant that they agreed to settle the matter via international panels of arbitration, and that was effectively the start of international law as we know it at sea. Certainly in terms of at least codifying it all, because up until then the law of the sea generally tended to consist of whatever the biggest and most dominant naval power in that area happens to say that it is, and if you happen to disagree, well, then you have to show up with warships and negotiate via cannon. So yes, ironically enough, CSS Alabama probably kicked off the start of codifying the international laws of the sea, and because of the economic effects that obviously people didn't like, it also began or rather should we say accelerated, the path of the decline of the privateer. Not that CSS Alabama was a privateer, it was in fact a fully commissioned warship, but there were other Confederate privateers around, and so this is why in the latter wars, things like World War I and World War II, you see that surface raiders are always commissioned warships, albeit they might be disguised as merchant ships, but they are commissioned warships rather than armed merchant ships that just happen to have a letter of marque from the given government. Admiral Tiberius asks, if you had the ability, money, and dockyard space to do so, what 4 warships that have been scrapped would you choose to save and preserve, regardless of how long ago it was? In addition to that, what 2 civilian ships would you choose to save as well? I'd say limit your choices for both categories to ships that were scrapped, since adding ships sunk in battle to the list would open up a Pandora's box of what-ifs. Thank you in advance. So with regards to the two civilian ships, it's a very easy choice for me instantly. I would say the Great Eastern, just because, well, yeah, come on, it's the Great Eastern. Blasted thing will probably last past the nuclear thermal death of the sun if it hadn't been broken up. Yeah, definitely one. Apart from anything, it'd be a good headquarters for the rest of my little naval exhibits. And in terms of the other one, it would be the Syracusia, because, well, again, who doesn't love a gigantic, hilariously oversized Roman-Greek galley type object with multiple towers, self-defense ballistas, and multiple sails? Yeah, that would put paid to quite a few people who try to think of the Roman and Greek period of history as somehow significantly more backward and underdeveloped technologically. Because yeah, you don't build something like this without a fair bit of technical know-how in industry. Now, as for military ships, well, since they were in service of the Chinese emperor and they were going out with troops aboard, I'm going to say that actually one of the Chinese treasure ships, as we were talking about before, definitely makes the list. No questions about that. Plus, it would look really interesting sticking it next to Syracusia to see the different kinds of obscure wooden ship design compared to what we commonly think of as wooden ships today. Then it would obviously have to be Warspite. It's a bit of a heart-wrenching decision between that, Vanguard, and Dreadnought, but ultimately Dreadnought represents the beginning of the era, Vanguard represents the end of the era, Warspite actually represents pretty much, well, not quite, but almost entirely the whole of the battleship era, the Dreadnought battleship era, and of course, come on, it's Warspite. If you didn't expect me to be saving that with a time machine, you haven't been watching this channel very much, have you? Next, and this isn't an exact representation, but it's about the closest I can find because we don't actually know what they look like. But going back to my Bolivian ancestry, way back in the times of the Inca Empire, Tupa Inca, who was quite often rated by historians as kind of the South American Alexander the Great, is reputed to have sent off a big fleet of trade ships of some description off into the Pacific. No one quite knows what happened to them, and no one really knows what they looked like, other than the fact that they were apparently very large. This is obvious. This is actually Viracocha too, which is a Inca-style reed boat that's been tooling around the oceans, along with a bunch of others. But yeah, so yeah, I have no idea what they look like, other than they're very big, and again, would have been completely unique in terms of ship historical design. So again, kind of cheating a little bit, but given that they again sailed with soldiers on board and were on behalf of the Inca, and that is actually the title of the ruler as well, I would want to grab one of them, just mainly out of curiosity, to be perfectly honest. And finally, I think I'd probably have to grab one of these things, the Popovs. Um, yeah, again, you might be detecting a theme here. Outside of Warspite, I tend to like the more eccentric, off-the-wall designs. This is one is actually very definitely a military ship. And yeah, it is very much, well, it's not quite a one-off, obviously, but it's near enough a one-off in terms of naval design. Very unique, and again, would be hilarious to sail around and see what people thought, especially given that apparently it's a ship that you can get up to a spin rate so rapid you can actually induce nausea and dizziness in the crew. So yeah, that'd be kind of the kids' fun theme park ride section of my little naval museum. Thank you very much for asking. It's not often I get to indulge my admiration and desire for weird and strange ship designs. But then again, I am British, so I guess eccentricity is somewhere down there in the DNA. Bill Cunningham asks, I have two questions. First, what is the personal significance of HMS Splendid that is part of your avatar? And second, were any Liberty ships ever used as commerce raiders or equipped with guns or flight decks? HMS Splendid, which as many of you may have noticed is on the badge cap on the little avatar of the channel, has a twofold meaning. One is, well, I like the name. Hopefully the idea of the channel is to be splendid, and some of you may recognise that particular motto from elsewhere. Comment down in the comment section below if you recognise where B Splendid actually comes from um, as a motto, and yeah, I might shake loose a little prize or two if you're correct. Anyway, yeah, so I like the idea of and the name of it anyway, but also as you might guess from the rather large submarine looming out of your screens at the minute, I do actually know somebody who served aboard HMS Splendid, who's quite a close family friend. Obviously, given the age of the Swiftsure-class, not one of my peers, but one of my parents' peers. And yeah, so that's kind of a twofold part. As if you're going to go for any kind of Royal Navy Cat badge, might as well go for something like that. In terms of the Liberty ships, no, there weren't any used as commerce raiders, pretty much for the aforementioned reasons when we're talking about the Alabama, in as much as, well, by the time they were out, what commerce was there to raid from the Axis powers that couldn't already be done much more efficiently by warships? In terms of fitting them out with guns, all Liberty ships were armed. They generally carried a 4-inch gun for use against submarines and varying levels of anti-aircraft armament, depending on the ship. Unfortunately, although I know in Convoy PQ-17 there was a rather amusing instance where a few merchant ships that scattered up into the Arctic managed to disguise themselves as icebergs and array Sherman tanks that they were carrying on deck, which would technically make them the most heavily armed merchant ships in the world. Unfortunately, none of the three involved were Liberty ships, so we can't use those. In terms of aircraft carriers, I'm not aware of any Liberty ships being converted for use as merchant aircraft carriers, but there were some Liberty ships that were provided with landing platforms to service early helicopters. So there is that. I mean, it's a landing platform of sorts, not full flight deck, but it's about as close to what you asked as I think you're going to get in reality. Sven Johnson asks, if the Americans had started World War II with the equivalent of the long lance torpedo, let's say they got the plans through espionage or captured a sample, and the Bureau of Ordnance had a moment of clarity and adopted it over the Mark 14, would there have been a measurable effect on putting the Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine out of the fight that much sooner? Would the Fletcher class have become the ultimate destroyer in the Pacific through this upgrade? Could this have turned the Battle of Samar and Taffy 3 engagement into a totally different engagement? Or, at the end of the day, is a single system like a torpedo not that weighted to be much of a difference to have an overall effect on history? So, I mean, obviously, the question lays out an assumption that the Mark 14 is replaced by the American Long Lance. If we assume for a minute that obviously logically includes upgrading the various launchers to be able to actually take the blasted things, then yes, that actually would have a measurable effect, because the number of ships that American submarines and, to be fair, other types of warship engaged with their torpedoes in the early part of the war only to hear either nothing or clangs because they were not working properly was quite significant. And if the US submarine force especially had had access to something like a Long Lance, especially if its warhead was re-equipped with something like Torpex, good grief, that would be terrifying. So yeah, you're basically giving the Americans a long-range, high-speed, very powerful torpedo instead of, well, yeah, the melee weapon that is the Mark 14 for the first 2 years of the war. That will make an awful lot of difference. There's going to be a lot more Japanese warships on the bottom. There's going to be a lot more Japanese merchant ships on the bottom. That's probably going to not necessarily bring the Japanese war machine to a screeching halt, but it's certainly going to put a very big spanner in the works and suddenly make them very, very worried about things. Plus, there's also obviously a whole series of attacks that American submarines were trying to set up on various Japanese warships and the like that they weren't able to pull off because of the limitations on their existing torpedoes. The range additional that they would have gotten out of something like a Long Lance would have allowed them to carry out some of those attacks, which potentially could see even more Japanese warships on the bottom than just simply those that were historically attacked and where it didn't work out. In terms of something like Samar, Taffy 3, well, I think the Japanese got a fair old pasting at the hands of Johnston and friends anyway, so I don't think it would make a massive amount of difference. Possibly the slightly larger warheads, more powerful warheads in an American version might have ensured that certain ships sank instead of were badly damaged, but that's neither here nor there in the overall outcome of things. It might take a few fewer torpedoes to put Musashi and Yamato on to the bottom, albeit that most of those are air-launched, so I don't think you're going to be trucking around a long lance equivalent from an aircraft anyway. I mean, well, Shinano's going down very quickly, but let's face it, Shinano went down very quickly anyway, so that's not really a factor. I mean, yeah, there are a number of Japanese warships that were hit and then recovered back to base for repairs. Yeah, they may or may not actually, they may not make it at all. So yeah, I mean, Yamato might take a few hits and possibly even be in a position to be finished off at Leyte at the Battle of Samar because, well, the long lance is pretty quick as well, so it did have to turn away from incoming American torpedoes. It might not quite get the chance this time, especially given the fact that the long lance had less of a wake, so it's moving faster and they're going to spot it later. So who knows? Yeah, it could have affected a number of historical engagements, but I think the single biggest thing is, well, instead of 2 years of American submarine commanders bashing their heads against the wall, they would actually reap a fairly impressive toll, especially, well, look what they did later on in the war once the Mark 14 actually worked. Japanese US cruisers, however, are going to be very, very thankful for the choice of removing torpedo launchers from their ships. Because, yeah, if they're going with the long lance equivalent powered by oxygen, yeah, I think everyone will agree that the decision to take torpedo tubes off of US cruisers was a very wise one. You might have a few US destroyers going boom, unfortunately. But overall, probably a net positive outcome. Oh, before I forget, one other possible place that might change things, assuming they retrofitted everybody with the same torpedoes, which is possibly a step too far beyond your original question, but assuming that, the Clemsons that were around for the Battle of the Java Sea historically launched their torpedoes, but the torpedoes didn't go anywhere near their targets because they were too short range. If some madman has equipped a bunch of Clemsons with long lance equivalents, they might actually reach that far, which might save some, not all, but some of the ABDA force from their inevitable destruction. Tree Shaker Tucker asks, was the German Navy's estimates at the start of World War II of how many merchant ships would be needed to be sunk to eventually starve out Britain remotely accurate? And also, what would have been the effect of the German Navy's torpedoes working as intended at the start of World War II? So, as far as their estimates go, in that classic, well, yes, but actually no. In theory, if they'd managed to sink 300,000 tons of shipping every month for the entire war, and then 700 to 750,000 tons of shipping once America had joined in, in theory, they might have induced sort of problems with supplies in the UK after a while, which could then obviously potentially force Britain to surrender. However, one, it's wildly optimistic, and they rarely, if ever, met those targets. And two, it's one of those classic situations of assuming that in your planning that the enemy is going to do nothing about it, because it's all very well sinking those ships, but if your enemy can replace ships at a rate faster than you can sink them, it doesn't actually matter how many of them you sink, as long as the enemy still has enough supplies and enough men to man the ships. And this is simply what happened. The Allies outbuilt the Germans by a significant amount. For every ship that sunk, I think it's something like 1.8 ships were built in terms of overall tonnage. So it was really on a hiding to nothing. If they'd managed to keep up those rates of sinking and Britain had not built much, if any, new merchant shipping, and none of its allies had either, then yeah, sure, in theory you would eventually run out of ships to sink. However, as I say, that assumes inaction on the British merchant, marine, and shipbuilders' parts, and they were building new ships. So, in that respect, no. Purely on maths, looking at the math, when you say, oh, well, the British had this many ships, to start with, therefore we need to seek X rate to have them down to a minimum viable number by this time. Sure. In reality, no. And the fact of German Navy torpedoes working as intended, they did, unlike Bureau of Ordnance, it actually fixed them in relatively good order. The single biggest change that I can easily point to is the fact that Ark Royal, very early in the war, during the incredibly misguided attempts to use fleet carriers as submarine hunters, yeah, that was one of Churchill's not so bright ideas. Yeah, but anyway, Ark Royal, shortly before Courageous did suffer the fate of being torpedoed by a U-boat, Ark Royal was torpedoed, but thanks to malfunctioning German torpedoes, it survived, and then obviously went on to do the various things that it did before eventually eating a functioning German torpedo and going down. So if Ark Royal had been lost that early in the war, I mean, that's an obvious, fairly big effect. And that obviously has knock-on effects, because Ark Royal was one of the most capable and highest capacity carriers that Britain had, and certainly one of the few large carriers, modern fleet carriers, that they had in service at the beginning of the war. So whether or not Ark Royal would have been around, or any carrier would have been around at Force H in order to be able to launch the strikes that would slow down Bismarck, is questionable at best. And even if they were, whether they'd be capable enough to reach the correct launch points, recover their aircraft, and launch big enough strikes, again, very much up in the air. It's entirely possible that the successful functioning of German torpedoes at the beginning of the war might have resulted in Bismarck making it to France. And there's a bit of a tangential connection for you. Daz Turk asks, when the US Navy started putting the large amounts of anti-aircraft weapons on their ships in World War II, did the regular crew, i.e. cooks and engine room sailors, man the extra guns, or did they have a larger crew to fill the weapons? If so, where did they sleep, eat, live, etc. on warships that were meant for a smaller crew? This was actually a legitimate problem that the US Navy faced, because, well, the guns weighed a certain amount, the ammunition weighed a certain amount, the various systems that you needed to keep them powered, etc., and the mounts themselves, and the sort of the gun pits and everything, they included weight. And although there was a certain amount of kind of double duty pulled by some of the crew, the simple fact of the matter is that naval ships don't sail with lots of additional crew just for fun, and so those men generally were needed in other areas. I mean, you definitely don't want your engineering crew up on deck where they can be strafed in the middle of a fight. That you want them down there in the engines. Some of the cooks and stuff, yeah, in theory you could train them as anti-aircraft gunners, but again, you kind of want them preparing the food, and also as part of just your damage control teams, because you do need hands on deck for that. So for the vast majority of the refitted anti-aircraft guns, it meant that they also had to bring in extra crew, which obviously, as you indicate, means extra food, extra weight of the crew themselves, equipment, bedding, etc., etc., etc. So, yeah, lots of extra crew. And where do they sleep, eat, and live? Pretty much where everyone else did. It was just a lot more compact. And this did, as I say, this did actually cause some major problems for certain types of warship, especially the Atlanta-class, because all that weight up top made them significantly more top-heavy than was really good for them, and so various things started having to be dropped. Same thing on a lot of destroyers, and even some battleships had to sacrifice a few bits and pieces to keep the top weight down to manageable levels. So yeah, it just meant everything was a little bit more cramped. Some rooms would be converted into extra messes or extra sleeping areas, and generally it was possibly somewhat less comfortable than designers had intended. But on the other hand, as US ships had been designed for long-distance cruising generally in the Pacific, they tended to be, in the first place, a little bit more comfortable than your average warship. So there was a little bit more headroom, as you could say, in order to incorporate the extra men without it turning into a complete sweatshop. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks a fairly long and somewhat flattering question, but basically comes down to what do you think about various warship guides that are growing increasingly frequent on YouTube and appear to copy your format? I mean, to be perfectly honest, between doing this channel, social life and the day job, I haven't really had that much time or chance to trawl through the depths of YouTube um, looking for said copycat channels. I mean, if they exist and they're any good, then great. Good luck to them. I mean, hopefully most of you have seen the interview with the chieftain that happened at Tankfest, and in there I meant everything I said when I said this channel is there to inspire people to take a closer look at naval history, and if I've managed to do so to the point that someone's investing time and money in creating their own YouTube channel to bring more naval history to the masses, then fantastic. As long as it's accurate and vaguely well put together, great. If there are such channels, let me know, and who knows, maybe I can give them some of my backlist and take it down from 8.5 years to something that won't see me into my mid-40s. No, so anyway, seriously, if that is happening, then I say my only caveat would be that they put in at least the same amount of effort in research to make sure that they get most of their points accurate as much as I do, because again, the one thing that made me set this channel up was basically a lack of many, if any, historically accurate naval channels. So the one thing I don't want to do is have more things like whichever video it was that rated the Fuso as like the 6th or 7th most lethal battleship of World War II. If I ever find whoever made that video, I'm coming for you with a blunt object. Anyway. George 2 asks, if you could choose to command any ship in World War II, which one and why? Now, this is a slightly different question to be on, and as I said before, if I could be on any one ship, it would probably be something like USS Massachusetts, because, well, she didn't lose anybody, so I get to live, guaranteed, huzzah. I like life. But command, as the picture might suggest, I would go for HMS Hood. And that's not particularly because I have a deep antipathy for the German Navy, but it's more about the fact that, let's face it, Hood's loss was an unadulterated tragedy from a human perspective. Over 1,400 people died pretty much instantaneously, and they were the lucky ones. I mean, anyone who was left alive after that magazine detonation for much longer couldn't have gone in a very calm or peaceful manner. So, yeah, if I was commanding a ship in World War II, that's me, Drickenevel 2019, I would almost immediately horribly abuse my foreknowledge, particularly in terms of knowing roughly where Bismarck was the night before, and therefore being able to push through Admiral Holland's plan as it originally intended and meet the Bismarck on something more akin to favourable terms for me. Would this save Hood? I don't know, honestly. It might not. It certainly would give Hood a much better fighting chance than it actually had. And to be honest, I think of any particular naval engagement in World War II, I think I would owe it most to that sheer amount of men to try and at least save most of them. Robert Henry Ilston asks, during the transition from oar-powered galleys to sail-powered galleons, did any navies or ships retain oars for secondary propulsion, and is the Hollywood depiction of using men in ships' boats to tow the vessel by oar accurate? So this is a rare case of truth in television, the latter part. Yes, ships' boats with their oars were regularly used to tow ships around, even, as you can see here, in the depiction of USS Constitution in the middle of action. The reason for this was very simple. Normally, a sail-powered ship, unsurprisingly, is powered by sails and therefore the wind. If the wind drops, and bear in mind that in an open ocean the wind can drop where you are, and may not necessarily be dropping a mile back or so where your enemy might be, there may well be a place that either you really need to get to, or you may be in a place where you really don't want to be in a few minutes. At which point your options are sit there and wait for the horribleness to overtake you, or get a bunch of men out and get them rowing. And obviously they would take the choice of getting the men rowing because they can actually get a ship moving. Not particularly fast, but then if the wind has becalmed you and is becoming people around you, the rest of you aren't probably going particularly fast either. The other thing that this particular technique could be used for would be to navigate a ship through particularly dangerous waters if it had the freedom to do so at low speed and the currents weren't too bad. Now, in terms of oars aboard ship, again, if for those of you who've watched Pirates of the Caribbean, the first one, the phrase "run out the sweeps" when the interceptor, or no, sorry, it's the Black Pearl, I think, could be both actually. I can't. Anyway, that chase sequence where you've got the Black Pearl chasing down the interceptor, and one or the other, or possibly both, run out oars and start rowing because there's no wind. Again, weirdly enough, truth in television. Small ships, up to the size of small frigates, did retain oars called sweeps for use in becalmed weather because, well, apart from anything, a ship that size may not carry many, if any, large boats, so they couldn't pull off this kind of trick as shown in the picture above. But also, there were issues with navigation, again similar to what you use boats for, and particularly in the Mediterranean, there for a considerable time was the risk of fighting galleys, which obviously were considerably more manoeuvrable under oars than sail-powered ships, and when the wind was becalmed they were especially more manoeuvrable, so small ships that might end up having to fight them that would otherwise be at a significant disadvantage if a galley could work around away from their broadside would quite often carry these sweeps, both for navigation in becalmed times and also navigation in shallow water, navigation in harbours, basically doing the roles that on a larger ship the ship's boats would do. So yes, they did exist, and they didn't go away for quite a while, surprisingly enough, although they were very uncommonly used and would not usually be used at all with sails as well, because, well, if there's enough wind for you to sail, then you're probably going to be going faster than your sweeps can get you to move. Mason Asher Stewart is bringing you your monthly dose of Ships Verses, at least until I can get around to doing another Ships Verses special. And he asks, fun what-if ship duels, Fletcher-class flotilla versus Narvik-class flotilla, and Alba versus Exeter. So, in the first case, I think I'm pretty definitively going to give it to the Fletcher class. The Narvik class, yes, they have quite a few quite large guns, but as mentioned in the Destroyer Development and Design into War video, the Narviks were not the most stable of ships, and they suffered quite significantly from having basically oversized guns for their hulls, and issues with loading and such that limited their rate of fire, limited their accuracy, and of course, without a tremendous amount of stability, couldn't take a tremendous amount of damage before they started to go turtle. So, as compared to the Fletchers, which I've quite often praised as one of the best destroyer designs of the World War II period, with fairly strong contender for being the best, certainly the most well-rounded, and their firepower is not inconsiderable. With their 5.5-inch guns, they've got good fire control systems, and so being relatively stable, so they're better. Effectively, you're looking at something it's a better sea boat, it's a more stable gun platform, it's got a higher sustained rate of fire, the shells, sort of broadside weight, the throwing down range is not tremendously different, and their fire control systems, as demonstrated by the Battle of Samar, are quite superb as well. So yeah, I would definitely give it to the Fletcher class there, Fletcher class flotilla, albeit that, let's be totally fair, the Narviks do have some fairly nasty torpedoes, and they do have a fairly nasty broadside if they manage to land a hit or two, so the Fletchers definitely aren't coming out of this unscathed. But I'd say the victory is quite solidly in the Fletcher's camp. Now, as far as Alba versus Exeter goes, now that is quite the quandary, really. I mean, they're about the same size, they're about the same displacement, they've got near enough as makes no difference about the same armament, both in guns at least, in terms of both having 6, well, near enough as makes no difference, 8-inch guns. They both have relatively minimal heavy AA battery that's not going to contribute all that much to things. Now, when it comes to advantages and disadvantages, the Alba has the advantage of more torpedoes, just about, and that is, I mean, that is that, and obviously they've got the superior torpedoes as well, so that gives the Alba an upper hand in a torpedo engagement. And also Alba is slightly faster, possibly a little bit more than slightly faster, depending on the time period of its service. But it does have a speed advantage. On the other hand, it doesn't have a range advantage. That goes to Exeter. So in a long distance race, Exeter will outrun it, but that's not going to happen really. So we're talking about a straight up battle. So Alba has the slightly heavier armament thanks to its slightly better and slightly more numerous torpedoes. Conversely, however, whilst the belt armour on either side at 3 inches basically isn't really worth writing home about, Exeter does have some slightly superior magazine protection. It's got a 5.5-inch thickness over its magazines, which does give it a degree of protection against Alba's shells over its most vulnerable explosive parts at the longer ranges that the engagement could take place on. Now, the interesting thing is going to be exactly when this battle takes place, because paradoxically, after the Battle of the River Plate, where Exeter showed a great deal of endurance and kept firing with a fair degree of accuracy given the circumstances, she was then refitted and given a Type 274 fire control radar, upgraded fire control equipment, and her secondary battery was pretty much doubled, which might actually make a difference in this kind of one-on-one cruiser fight. But then when she actually ended up fighting the Japanese during the ABDA command period, her gunnery was actually significantly worse than when she was engaging Graf Spee, which is a bit of a paradox, but there you go, considering she in theory had significantly better fire control equipment and radar at that point. So yeah, go figure. Overall, if the engagement stays as a gunfight, then River Plate era Exeter, sure, I'd give the Exeter a slight advantage, as long as the range stays open. Theoretically, if the systems and crew are working as intended, it should have an even bigger advantage once it's been refitted with proper fire control radar and such like, even though historically for some reason that didn't seem to quite work out. But at the same time, Alba is faster and can close, and if it does so, it does have the slightly superior torpedo armament, and there is a realistic sort of medium gun range at which point Exeter's superior magazine armour won't help it, and ultimately, let's face it, things like the machinery spaces are still vulnerable. So I would say long range for cruisers, at least gunfire fight, advantage goes to Exeter. As the range closes in, the advantage probably switches towards Alba, assuming that it survives to get to that range, which is entirely possible. So yeah, go with that. The only time where I say Exeter has a decisive advantage, all told, is sort of end of its career, 1942 era Exeter in rough weather, because it has multiple radar sets and therefore can actually find targets and shoot in bad weather and night engagements, which Alba can't. Well, it can, because the Japanese had reasonable reasonable night fighting training, but I don't think that's going to compete with radar, as was proven several times during the US's engagements with the Japanese. But yeah, so there you go. Circumstantially, possibly Exeter. Overall, toss a coin. And lastly, for this part A of the Patreon Q&A Drydock, Lord Hawthorne says, Hydrack, in your estimation, in the event of a war between Russia and the UK in 1905, what were the odds of Admiral Beresford's planned fair fight of 4 battleships versus the 2nd Pacific Squadron, resulting in the loss of all the Russian ships with no losses on the British side? I don't think that's going to happen, to be honest. Apart from anything else, I don't think the British ships have the ammunition on 4 battleships to put down the entire 2nd Pacific Squadron. But also, realistically, yes, the British ships were good, certainly in comparison to the 2nd Pacific Squadron, but then I'd probably do better than the 2nd Pacific Squadron if you teleported me as I'm sitting here right now into their gunnery compartments. So it's not exactly a high threshold to cross. But that said, there were a couple of ships in the 2nd Pacific Squadron that could shoot straight, and obviously the British don't necessarily know which ones they are. And quantity has a quality all of its own. I mean, let's face it, Tsushima was not a one-sided curb stomp. Well, to a certain degree it was, but it wasn't as much of a one-sided curb stomp as you might otherwise think, in as much as the Russians did actually get some hits in on the Japanese ships that required repairs. So, yeah, it might have seemed that way to Admiral Beresford, and he had a certain degree of confidence in obviously saying that. But sinking the entire 2nd Pacific Squadron with 4 ships? No. And sinking them all with no losses to the British side? Unlikely. Certainly, I mean, maybe they don't lose any ships of the 4 because they can just withdraw and replace them with others, but they're certainly not coming out of this unscathed by any measure. I think it would have been highly inadvisable and inappropriate of Beresford to engage with just the 4 ships if it had come down to that. Overall, in overall consideration, yes, he might have potentially won, in as much as he might have forced the 2nd Pacific Squadron to come to terms and give up the fight. But he's not sinking the entire squadron, and if he tries, he's not going to do it without loss, certainly. Definitely, if it came down to a fight like that, I think he probably would have had to bring in the rest of the Mediterranean fleet and the other ships that were tailing it. Apart from anything else, as I've said before, primary responsibility outside of war and even within war, as far as you can control it, is to your men, and to go in with just 4 battleships against the entire 2nd Pacific Squadron is a step too far in terms of arrogance, in my opinion. It makes for a good soundbite, and who knows, he might even have actually planned it, but as a competent naval commander, I wouldn't advise it. That's not saying I'm a competent naval commander, just to be clear. I'm just saying I would not expect a competent naval commander to advise it. I unfortunately do not have a track record of commanding imperial ships at war. And so that brings us to the hour mark, roughly speaking, of this Drydock Patreon edition of the Drydock Q&A. So, yeah, look out for the next one coming up any minute now if you're viewing this from new.